Hey guys, quick little intro thing before we actually get into the video proper. One, as you can see, finally a change of scenery. Finally got a chance to move. In fact, I moved several weeks ago, but it's taken a while to actually get things set up, and things are still not exactly set up the way I'd like, as you probably can tell. Hopefully I'll be able to get like a decent screen, kind of fitting for the videos I make. That will actually, look nicer than just simply having a futon in the back and these freaking blinds in the way. So I don't know how long it will be before I'm able to afford something like that, but I'm just hoping to have like a nice screen to just put there and then use that. And also, the place I moved into obviously is bigger than where I was at before, with a much nicer kitchen. So I do plan on bringing back the whole cooking on a budget thing in full. So for those of you guys who like those, expect to see more. How many more, I can't really say. It's not exactly like, I'm one of those guys that has a cooking show with millions of different recipes and have a background in gourmet cooking or cuisines, but, I'll try my best to like come up with stuff that I usually can make on the cheap, and sometimes not as cheap, but still affordable enough. We'll see how far I can push it. But the whole point of that series was just to help people out who need to be able to have food in a budget. I'm noticing a lot of young people just either don't know how to cook or don't know how to put something together without killing their wallets, and that's what the whole series is for. So hopefully I can, keep that going with a lot more episodes instead of just a few more. And finally, and this is not nearly as important, well, it might be important to some of you, don't get too attached to this here, because probably right after this video it's gonna get cut. Not because I really want to. I actually like having a beard. Problem is, it's not growing the way I'd like. I noticed before it was growing kind of uneven, so I was like, every time I shaved the sides, I was like kind of adjusting this to try to make it uneven on both sides, and I kind of messed up in one of my adjustments. And if I try to adjust it any further, I'm just going to end up cutting this whole thing out of shape. So I'm reaching the point where I'm just saying, hell with it. I'm basically just burning down the forest and starting from scratch. So I'm just giving you guys warning now. For those of you who've gotten used to this is going to be off soon, just so I can start it back up from scratch and make it decent. So yeah, there we go. Anyway, enough of that. On with the actual topic. Hey guys, what's up? So, sword lengths. This is something that I think I may have touched on before, though I don't think I did a whole video dedicated to it. I may have touched on it, a couple of times in different videos, or especially when people were asking me my opinions on what I think the right sword length should be for a Chinese Jian. And I've given, my basic ideas on it, but I thought I'd go a little bit more in depth because the subject is actually a little bit more complicated than you may think. Generally speaking, when you speak to Chinese martial arts on the length that your sword should be, you're gonna get a couple of conflicting answers. But they generally boil down to either someone saying that there's a fixed length that they should have, and then other people saying that it's kind of based on your body length, like how tall you are and how long your limbs are, and that the swords are sort of made to order depending on what type of martial art, your own specifications and what type of martial arts you are. And both answers are not exactly true. Like, there's some basis in truth to them, but they're also not exactly true. And again, the answer is a bit more complicated than you may think. And when you throw modern swords into the mix and then compare them to antique swords, and then you also look at how swords are made today, and in comparison to how swords were made in the past, and the different upheavals that happened within Chinese history and the art of sword making, the answer gets even more complicated. So even though this was a topic I wanted to touch on and like put a proper video on for a while, I was perplexed as to how to present this information, especially since at the end of the day, I don't exactly have a concrete answer. Like, I think I got a concrete enough answer, but there's still some variables that must be discussed. So I'm going to warn you guys right off the bat that there will be some conjecture thrown into this. I am going to be dealing with facts. I am going to be presenting the facts as I know them to you. But I will also be offering a little bit of my opinion as to, the lengths of swords and also the weight that they should be. The two are intertwined, as I'm sure many of you guys should be able to guess. And it should be pretty easy for you to figure out why the two are mixed. But yeah, I'm gonna go into the facts, and then I'm going to just give my particular opinions and my own, understandings of how I think these things should be, how they should be constructed, how long they should be, and what you should expect out of them. So let's start. First, I'm going to start with what we know. Generally speaking, when it comes to looking at antique Jian, antique straight swords, Chinese straight swords, what we typically see is that the lengths can be, they could be anywhere from, I've seen Jian starting at around, say, 63 centimeters, which is about 25 inches, up to about, say, 32 inches or, 81 centimeters, give or take. That tends to be the range that we see for one-handed Jian. Two-handed Jian, it just kind of runs the gamut. But generally, I see them anywhere from, again, about the 32-inch range, again, 81 centimeters. But I've seen certain, examples of two-handed swords, as high as, say, 36 inches in length, a blade length anyway. We're talking about blade lengths, by the way, not the overall length of the sword, just the blade lengths. I've seen them as much as 36 inches in blade length, or 91 centimeters, or sometimes even longer, sometimes up to 40, which, again, let me look at the calculations here, because I got a little calculator in front of me. Yeah, about 101 centimeters, though I think that's more of a modern interpretation of a two-handed sword, but I've actually seen one that was 40, and I was like, whoa. But that's for a two-handed Jian. So when you see them running the gamut like that, it's fairly easy to think that, well, they must be made to order. Slow down. You have to consider that a lot of Chinese civilians, especially like peasants or, even just commoners who had at least a little bit of money, they couldn't afford things like Jian. Swords back then were expensive. Really expensive. Not only that, but weapons tended to be regulated in China throughout the many different dynasties. So if you were, fortunate enough or unfortunate, however you look at it, or whether you were obligated to carry a sword that was made for fighting, that generally was going to be a standard length, especially if you were in the military. The military is not going to be making things to order unless you happen to be, part of nobility or something, a high-ranking official. And even then that means you're going to be making it to order for yourself. The government's not going to be doing it for you. Generally speaking. So typically, if you got your hands on a weapon, they were going to be made to standard lengths. And what we usually see is the average tends to be about 28 inches. Or if we're going to be looking at the calculations here, about 71 centimeters. A little over 71, give or take. That tends to be what we see in blade lengths. But we also see, I've also seen one-handed ones going up to about 30. Now, by the way, when we're talking about blade lengths, there has to be a distinction made here. A lot of people think that when we're measuring these sorts of weapons, that we're measuring from the end of the handguard here up to the tip. That's actually not what we're measuring, at least traditionally. Traditionally speaking, when you're measuring it, you're supposed to start from the base of the blade itself. You're basically starting right at the end of the handguard. Right here at the bottom. Right where the end of the handle, where the handle starts and the blade begins. That's what you're measuring. So you have to include this in your calculation. If you're not, and you're starting from here for the 30, you might be working on a blade that might be too long for you. More on that later, but just keep that in mind. When we're talking blade lengths, we're starting from here. We're not starting from here. So, especially since when you consider that there are a lot of different handguards to begin with of different measurements, yeah, if you're going to be measuring the blade, you're going to be starting from the base anyway. So, with that said, we now have to start talking about weight. The reason why we have to start talking about weight is because obviously the more material you add to the blade, the heavier it's going to be, right? If you're, working with blades and you're making them a certain way and they're saying they're about, the 28 inches or the 71 centimeters, you're going to have an average weight. And the average weights that we typically see with at least antique Jian from around the Ming and Qing dynasties, especially like the Qing dynasties, we usually find them to be from 1.5 to 2 pounds, give or take. That's pretty much it. We don't really see them lighter than that unless it's pure decoration, and we don't really see them heavier than that unless there's like a heavy emphasis on cutting, or they were just made really bad. There are some rare examples. In fact, I did see an antique Jian that was around 3 pounds. I mean, that was like a heavy duty cutter with a really wide blade. But that was an outlier. Generally speaking, antique swords tend to be around 1.5 to 2 pounds. And this is running, within that length range of, 28 inches to 30 inches, or 71 centimeters to 76 centimeters. Again, give or take. These are approximations. Now, any of you guys who have held a modern-made Jian that's not one of those wushu floppy tinfoil type things, well, not made of tinfoil, but you know what I mean. If you're not working with those things, you may have noticed something. The swords we're dealing with seem to be a lot heavier than that, right? Or at least, okay. Let's start with cold steel, which I know some people are going to be, ugh, them. Well, other people might be happy with them. I remember when cold steel started putting out Jian several years back. Theirs were running kind of heavy. You were looking at swords around 30 inches that were like close to 3 pounds, starting at around 2.5 pounds to 3. And it was just like, what the? At the time I'm looking at these things going, that seems kind of heavy. And there were a couple of other people, kind of more macho buff dudes who were like, well, that's the way Jian really were. They're supposed to be heavy, These days everyone's running around with that wushu steel. They don't seem to realize real swords for real men. You need to have muscles. Okay. For a while, I sort of accepted that argument. I say sort of, because I definitely didn't want to run around with a Jian that weighed 3 pounds. That's too much. Especially, and I was like, okay, maybe it had something to do with the length. Because it did seem that these days we were running around with swords that were longer than average. Like, and you look at the older antiques, they're around, again, the 28-inch range. And these days we're running around with 30, 32 for one-handed swords. So I was thinking, okay, yeah, since we're working with practice swords anyway, they're much lighter, maybe we're just not used to, the weight's a bit too much because maybe we're not used to it because we're working with lighter, weapons that were made more for practice. And not only that, but we're making them longer than they should be, and that's what's adding the extra weight. If we kept it to around the 28-inch range, then they'll be sticking at the weights that they should. That's what I thought. But then, especially when things started to get a little bit better in the Chinese weapons market, they still need a hell of a lot more improvement, but it's a lot better than when I first started looking for weapons. I kept noticing the same problem. Too many modern-made swords are weighing a crap ton. Like, just recently, I saw a sword. I really wanted to get my hands on this. It was going for fairly cheap, and it was, it had like they called it their Wudon Jian. Nice, simple, but elegant-looking handguard on it. 28 inches, but hey, I could deal with that. By the way, my own personal preference, I like working with swords that are 30 inches, which I thought made me an outlier, but recently I found out that if we want to go with the whole measuring your body method, then actually 30 inches is actually what I'm supposed to be using, since I'm 5'7". I didn't know, but there we go. But this one was 28 inches in blade length. Okay. Elegant looking fittings, decent blade. Weight, 3 pounds. Wait, what? 3 pounds. And that's without the scabbard. What the hell is going on? And again, I'm sure some people will be going, well, that's the way they're supposed to be. But I remind you, the antiques that we've seen, at least from the Qing dynasty, they don't go over 2 pounds. Not up to 3. It's very rare to find those. And those particular models tend to have really wide blades. Not really wide, but wider than normal blades for a Jian. So what the hell is going on? Well, there's something else I happen to know about the Chinese weapons market. And it's that they're rediscovering how to make these things. Yeah. Well, that's unfair. I shouldn't say they're rediscovering. They kind of, they more or less have figured out how to make these things, but that was recently, fairly recently in history. Let's just put it this way. If you were trying to buy a Chinese straight sword comparable to a real, like an antique fighting sword from China way back when, and you were trying to buy one back in the 90s or 80s, good luck. And if you did find someone who knew what the hell they were doing, you willing to spend thousands? Because that's how much you're going to be spending. Because next to nobody in mainland China knew how to make these things properly anymore. That was a shock to me, but that was something that was told to me by an insider several years back. That part of the reason why it was very hard to find a decent Jian for cutting practice and one that was made like the way it was made in the old days is because they plain just forgot how to do them. Now, that may sound far-fetched. You're like, how the hell does China forget how to make their own freaking weapons? Well, Chinese blacksmiths. It's not like all of China makes the weapons. But how the hell does that happen? It's happened before. Yeah. I don't really want to go too deep into Chinese history, especially since there's still a lot that I'm learning about it. But what I have learned is that throughout many different dynasties, there's been like this period of rising and falling when it comes to Chinese weapon production and the quality of those weapons. There were some dynasties where the weapon making was praised, like during the late Han Dynasty, where they really started understanding how to work with steel, and then that's when we started seeing these things. Well, not really these things, but the things that looked like these, because this is a modern interpretation. But basically, the Han Dynasty had a period where they were starting to make some really good swords, really starting understanding how to use steel. Another time period was the Tang Dynasty, which was also known for making excellent weapons. And in fact, that's where a lot of people state that, that's where the katana came from. The Tang knife, or the, Tang Dao, was transported to Japan. The Japanese took a look at it and were like, oh, this is awesome, and then refined it and made their own swords based off that original design. If you look at Japanese chokuto and you look at Tang knives, they're very similar. So there is a lot to that argument. But the point is, there was a time when, Chinese weapons were made with a certain level of refinement, and people were like, oh yeah, these weapons are awesome. And then there were other times when the weapons were of rather low quality, and people, even in that time period, were going, what the fuck is going on with our swords? And there was a lot of bemoaning about the low quality of their weapons, especially compared to their Japanese counterparts many years down the line, when they're like looking at how well refined the katana were, and then they're looking at their own swords going, what the fuck? Fast forward to after the Republican era, where, they're trying to, especially during the Republican era was when there was kind of like this resurgence of Chinese martial arts. Like, Chinese martial arts was already going through a decline before that. The Boxer Rebellion did not do it any favors. And people were now taking a whole new approach to Chinese martial arts. Like, what are we practicing this for? But then with the fall of the Republican era and the rise of communism in China and this new communist regime, and especially when the Cultural Revolution happened, that's pretty much when traditional arts and everything associated with it just got thrown right out the window. And that included making these things. So once again, you had a period where, these things are no longer being made, and the people who did know how to make them were either killed off or persuaded not to, do that anymore. And fast forward, to a time period now where we need to come up with, weapons to practice with and train with, and all we really have is just practice weapons that weren't really made to the specifications of actual fighting swords. I'm pretty sure there were a few blacksmiths who still knew what the hell they were doing, at least in Taiwan. And maybe there were a few in China, keeping them, on the down low. But by and large, making, these things be made in a wide scale at, at the same type of quality as, say, katana, wasn't really happening. Now, this is where things get interesting, because later, as the market really began to grow for Japanese weapons and for European weapons, Chinese blacksmiths wanted to get in on, the action, and not only that, but you could make these weapons cheaper in China than you could do it elsewhere. And this is how companies like Hanwei were able to, rise up, because, the costs are cheaper over there. So companies, Hanwei in particular, they really got their start making these sorts of weapons, at a much cheaper price. Other blacksmiths, smaller blacksmiths, other companies saw this and were like, shit, we could do the same thing. And so they started popping up, making katanas, and later on jumping into, the Western markets. But the one thing that they weren't making were these. Because again, for one thing, these really weren't in demand. At least functional versions of these weren't really in demand yet. And they just kind of forgot how to do it. In a weird sort of way, and this is kind of funny because you constantly keep seeing this happening over and over again with Chinese history. It took them making swords from other cultures to kind of build their knowledge on how to make these. You did have a couple of notable blacksmiths, like I remember this one guy, this is one company, Jianwoo, was one of the first to really come out in the forefront to start making decent Chinese weapons again. In fact, he was the guy who originally first started making these modern versions of these. I still remember bumping into that website like way back around 2004, 2005, finding this sword on a Chinese site and going, what is that? Like, it was so different from any other Chinese straight blades I saw, and I immediately had to own one. Like, I had to have one. But it cost over $1,000. Remember what I told you in the beginning, if you wanted a decent sword. But later, as other blacksmiths started copying designs, I'm sure many of you guys know that right now, that copying things and coming up with cheaper versions of them isn't anything new in China. Just about any type of merchandise you can think of, someone's going to make a cheaper version of it sooner or later. As swords started flooding the market, decent cutting swords started flooding the market, you were able to get these things cheaper, and more blacksmiths began figuring out how to make these weapons again. And it was their work with making Japanese weapons and European weapons that they were able to kind of like sort of reverse engineer the process of making those into making straight swords, and then looking at museum pieces and working from that. And we are more or less where we are right now, where if you know where to look, there are some companies out there, certain forges, where you can get a decent Jian. But at the level of the antiques, I'd say we're close, but not quite there yet. Depending on what forge you're looking at, you could end up with something that maybe it might be good for practice. And one thing I will say about the Chinese market, if all you're looking for is a sword to just practice your forms with, you could get one almost anywhere for a really cheap price, under $100, and it'll serve you well. But if you're looking for something that's actually, functional, like live steel, the fittings are properly made, it's not going to rattle on you, the steel is well tempered, then you got to do some hunting. Like, the market's better than it was before, but, you got to know where you're getting it from. You got to make sure you're getting it from a decent source. So what the hell does all that have to do with sword length and weight? Well, you have to make sure that, one, you're working with a length that you're comfortable with, because that's the thing. To get back on topic, how long should a Jian be? As long as as your demands of your style and your own particular ability call for. I will say, generally speaking, if you're using a one-handed Jian, you want it around the 28 to 30 inch range. Or for those of you who are using a much, saner measuring system, you want to work with something around the 71 centimeter range to the 76 centimeter range for a one-handed Jian. If you're taller, maybe you want to go to 32 inches or something longer than that. But, and again, centimeters is 81. But keep in mind that the longer you make it, the heavier you're going to make the sword. And the heavier you make the sword, the more strain you're going to get in your forearms and especially your wrist performing certain movements. There's going to be a lot more torque when you're making certain cuts, especially those mincing cuts. Those cuts where you got to like do that kind of, or for those of you who are used to doing it with a long sword or especially a katana, that kind of strike you do with it where it's just like bam, like that. There are one-handed versions of that with the Jian. And the heavier that sword is, the more strain you're going to be putting on your wrist as you do that. And length, the heavier it is. And keep in mind what I told you before. they're kind of making swords a little heavier than they should be because they haven't quite figured out how to make them properly yet. So you gotta keep that in mind. Unless you're getting your sword from a forge that knows what the hell they're doing, don't want to make it too long. You got the weight to worry about. Oh, and my light just turned off. Sorry guys, let me adjust. Again, I'm still getting things set up here. Hope you don't mind that. So you got to deal with that, you know, the length and the weight and that, and you have to make sure you're getting it from a forge that actually knows what they're doing. If the forge doesn't really know what they're doing and they're making swords that are way too heavy, well, for one thing, you probably shouldn't be getting a sword from them anyway. But if that's your option, that's what you're stuck with, you don't want it too long. The other thing to consider is the style. Certain styles of Jian swordsmanship rely more on thrusts and others rely more on cutting. If you're relying on one that's more on thrusts, you definitely want that point control. So, you know, a lighter Jian would make a bit more sense. Whereas if you're working with a style that definitely puts more pronouncement on the cutting, you're doing a lot more cuts, a lot more chopping, you're going to want the blade to be a bit heavier. And, you know, maybe you can get away with it being a bit shorter as well. You know, more point thrusting, you want it to be longer, but you also kind of want it to be a little bit lighter than normal, and that's kind of hard to find these days. Heavier, shorter ones you can definitely find, though I find them to be a little bit too heavy. Some of these forges I think are making them way too heavy, in my opinion. Now, I will be lenient and say that you can get away with a one-handed Jian that weighs about 2.5 pounds, though you're going to have to build that forearm and wrist strength. But once you start creeping toward 3, that's way too much. Way too heavy. So, yeah, you see a sword that's like around that, look elsewhere. And don't forget, you also have point of balance to consider. Remember that you don't want the point of balance to be too far toward the point, even if it's going to be a cutter. Because no matter what your Jian fighting style, you still are going to be relying on the thrust. And you still need to have decent point control. And you want the blade to be lively in your hand. So you basically want it to be around here. For, you know, you basically want it to be, you know, you don't want it to go past 4.5 inches from the guard. You really don't. You want to make sure that you're working, you know, but you don't want it too close to the handguard either, or you won't get a good cut. So it's kind of interesting in a way how similar this is to, say, choosing a good long sword or choosing a good side sword or arming sword. Because to be honest, they're similar weapons used in a somewhat similar way. Especially, you know, something like, I say, a side sword. A side sword, I think, is probably the closest European equivalent to a Jian, because they're both cut and thrust swords. And looking at the property of a cut and thrust sword in one culture kind of gives you an idea. And you'll notice that the measurements that I'm giving you, I'm pretty sure somebody who studies Western sword fighting is probably like, yeah, that's pretty similar to what I have to work with. After all, it doesn't really matter what the culture is. We're still human beings using 2 arms, 2 legs. We're going to fall within similar parameters when it comes to weapons and what works best for us. So, yeah, that's a lot that I probably threw at you. I'm not too sure I was able to give you guys a concrete answer because there's a lot of factors involved, and I haven't even gone. There's a deeper, you know, aspects I can go into on this when it comes to trying to pick the right length and, you know, what you're using it for and what style you're using it for. But generally speaking, if you want to, like, what's the right length for me? If you're using a one-handed Jian, I really think that you should stick around the 28 to 30 inch range. If you're really tall, you could probably get away with 32. Funny thing is, I actually used to use one-handed 32 inch blades for a while. My Hanwei practice one, in fact, is a 32 incher. And I use that one-handed. No problems with my form, although that sword is pretty light. But if you're going to be putting some weight to it, I'm realizing these days it's probably best not to go past 30, just for the sake of your wrist. If you're using two-handed ones, then yeah, you can probably get away with stretching it further. But keep in mind the weight. You don't want that sword to go past 2.5 pounds, in my opinion. Again, think of the strain on your wrist. I hope that clears some stuff up. There's a lot I threw out there. And I'm also hoping that the Chinese sword market, you know, and the forges finally get to the point where they consistently can make swords that are at the weights, you know, at the specifications of the swords we used to see in the past. We're a lot closer than we used to be, but we could still stand for some improvement. All right, that's it. Hope this is entertaining and informative for you guys, and I'll catch you guys later.